Our reading today is from Mark, chapter 10, verses 35 through 45. And James and John, the sons of Zebedee, came up to him and said to him, "Teacher, we want you to do for us whatever we ask of you." And he said to them, "What do you want me to do for you?" And they said to him, "Grant us to sit, one at your right hand and one at your left, in your glory." Jesus said to them, "You do not know what you are asking. Are you able to drink the cup that I drink, or to be baptized with the baptism with which I am baptized?" And they said to him, "We are able." And Jesus said to them, "The cup that I drink, you will drink, and with the baptism with which I am baptized, you will be baptized. But to sit at my right hand or at my left is not mine to grant, but it is for those for whom it has been prepared." And when the 10 heard it, they began to be indignant at James and John. And Jesus called them to him and said to them, "You know that those who are considered rulers of the Gentiles lord it over them, and their great ones exercise authority over them. But it shall not be so among you. But whoever would be great among you must be your servant, and whoever would be first among you must be slave of all. For even the Son of Man came not to be served, but to serve, and to give his life as a ransom for many." The word of the Lord. Thanks.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Jake. I'm one of the pastors here, and it's so great to be with you here this morning. We are continuing our series called The Symbols of Christ here this morning. And when we think about a symbol points to, represents, or tells a story about something beyond itself. And yet, at the same time, what we need to understand about symbols is that symbols also reveal something deeper about ourselves. Because as much as a symbol points out to something, the reality is that when it comes to certain symbols, different people have different reactions and responses to those symbols. So here's a great example, right? Right there. Some of us look at that symbol and say, 2018 World Series champions, the season is starting, let's go again, let's defend the championship. Others of you are booing because you're Yankees fans or something, and so it eviscerates different responses from you. And still others of you in here are going, "Oh, come on, like, I don't even care, it's baseball, whatever. What sport is that? It's like, it's not your jam." So this one symbol points outwardly to the Boston Red Sox, and yet emotionally, internally, this whole room had different responses to that one symbol. And so we are surrounded by symbols every single day that are doing the exact same thing. They're defining something about ourselves. They're telling the world about ourselves, and it even helps us, they tell us where we fit or where we don't fit, how we want to be represented, how we don't want to be represented. So every one of these symbols points to something beyond us and yet reveals a truth about something internally and where we are. And the 6 symbols of Christ that we're going to look at throughout this series, so water and baptism last week, the basin this week, communion, the meal next week, The palm branches on Palm Sunday, the cross at our Good Friday gathering on Friday night, and then the empty tomb on Easter Sunday. Every single one of those symbols points to something beyond ourselves, into the life of Christ, into a life that has been modeled for us, and yet also reveals something deeper about ourselves. And so for some, there's a positive response. So looking at baptism last week, for some of us, there was warm memories of our baptism past. For others, there was excitement. There were a number of you who were like, man, the next time we have a baptism, I'm in. I'm looking forward to that. And yet others of you, maybe you're still skeptical. You look at some of these symbols and you're like, I'm not quite sure, and you're asking some really, really deep questions. And I just want to encourage you in those questions. I'm glad you are here. At Trinity, we believe that you can belong before you believe, and that this can be a place that you wrestle with that skepticism and those doubts and those questions. And so continue to ask those things. And then still for others, maybe these symbols are going to provide a challenge. Because a symbol, when it reveals something within us, maybe that something doesn't actually align with what the external symbol is pointing to. And so I actually hope that some of these symbols make us uncomfortable. And I'll be honest, the symbol today has made me uncomfortable. I've wrestled with this sermon. I haven't even gotten through it all the way once because I've kept stopping, and I'm personally being challenged. So hopefully I can get through it once here now in front of you all. And so some of these symbols will challenge us. So as we dive in for today, as we think about the Basin, I want to start with a little activity, and I want you to pretend with me here for a moment. You are a CEO of your own company, and on your desk you have 2 resumes, and you have 1 open executive level position. And so I want to look at these kind of 2 resumes, these 2 people, and I want you to think about who is it that you would hire for your open role. So person A, they take initiative. They're assertive and decisive. They get things done. They're very focused. They're driven. They'd be described as a type A, very bold type of a personality. They have pedigree, lots of experience, and are very well networked. So that's resume A. Resume B, person B, they're a lot more reserved. They seek a lot of wisdom, a lot of counsel before they make decisions. They give a lot of chances. So when some of their past employees or coworkers have made mistakes, there's a lot of grace shown to them. And then you Googled them, and you've discovered they've kind of got a messy family life, and there's this one really big skeleton in the closet, this moral failure. And then this person comes from a very humble background. They're not as well experienced, and they don't necessarily have the network that person A has. And so you're CEO, you've got these resumes in front of you. Which person are you going to lean towards hiring? You can be honest. That's not rhetorical. I would venture to guess the majority, raise your hands if you'd go for A. You'd lean in that direction, right? Obviously, there are unknowns. I know there are some of you who are like, well, how did they respond in the interview? Like, you need more details, and that's fine. Yeah. But just looking at the surface level, and a lot of times we would lean towards person A. And I had to write a paper on this exact topic in college. It's the only paper that I have like visceral memories of because it was such a profound experiment as I leaned into this question. Because if you have been doing the Year Biblical Literacy readings, you may have picked up on that person A really describes King Saul, and person B describes King David. And it's a fascinating question to think about when it comes to the John Maxwells or the Patrick Lenciottis or Leadership 101, who has the better attributes of a leader as far as how they manage people, how they operate, how they exert their authority, how they make decisions. And time after time, I kept coming to that conclusion that really Saul is the much better leader. And I've been thinking about it from a church standpoint, too, when you look at David's moral failure and the things that happened. Like if you're hiring a leader for a church community, David's out right away, right? And yet, Saul, it's told, his rule was marked by regret. and he was rejected by God, and David was known as a man after God's own heart. And there's this very popular verse in 1 Samuel 16 that you would have read last week. The Lord sees not as humans see. Humans look at the outward appearance, but the Lord looks at the heart. And so the way that God views the world is different than our culture and different than ourselves. God's view of success, God's character traits that are most important don't always align with the way that we say things. And today, as we consider the Basin, I want to compare and contrast these two different views. One view of the world, one view of our culture that we see exemplified in the passage that we read today, and then the other view, a different view that Jesus seems to suggest and to emulate and models for us within the feet washing. And so in the passage we read, James and John, they're two brothers, they come up to Jesus. They've been following him for about 3 years. They've seen the miracles. They've seen feeding of the 5,000. They've sat through the Sermon on the Mount and teachings and parables. They've had all of this experience with following Jesus. And so they approach Jesus and they ask him this bold question. Teacher, we want you to do for us whatever we ask. It's a bold question, right? Bold question. In a lot of ways, what they're doing is they're asking Jesus for this blank check. They followed Jesus all this time. They know that a culminating event is about to happen. Jesus is heading towards Jerusalem. Something is coming. Jesus has talked about his death 3 times up to this point, and the disciples don't quite get it. But they know something is coming, and so James and John see this opportunity, and they're like, Jesus, we want you to do whatever we ask. We want this blank check. And so Jesus says, okay, what do you want? And they respond, grant us to sit, one at your right and one at your left, in your glory. And the in your glory part is really important and helps us understand what they're getting at. See, growing up Jewish, they would have heard stories about the Messiah. They would have studied it. They would have told stories. They would have been longing for the Messiah to come. And the expectation there is that the Messiah was going to overthrow the Roman government, reestablish Israel as a nation, and set up a new throne and a new kingdom. And so this is an artist rendering of what Solomon's throne room would have looked like, David's son. And so this is what they would have had in mind. Jesus, when you overthrow Rome, when the revolution begins, when you take back Israel, when you sit on your throne, we want to drag chairs right up there. We want to sit one at your right and one at your left in your glory. Now, what's also interesting is James and John, they were the first ones to follow Jesus. When you read the gospel accounts, they're the first ones that Jesus calls. And so you can almost hear the entitlement behind them. We were first. We've been here the longest. Jesus, we want to sit at your right and your left. We deserve this. And so that's the request that they have of Jesus. This worldview that they're living into is one marked as a consumer. It's driven by this hunger for status, for power. They're feeling entitled. They feel like they deserve. They want what they want. And the underlying theme is, well, this is what I want. My attitude is about what's for me. And if we're honest, this is the same kind of mindset that drives our Western culture. In his book, Sapiens, historian Yuval Noah Harari says this: humans have been designed to live and think as community members. Within a mere 2 centuries, we have become alienated individuals. We are now defined above all by what we consume. If we're honest, how much of our lives ask the same question that Peter and James ask? Do for us whatever we want. And so we consume in order to fill our lives up. We just think if we buy more, we have better power, a better job, more money, all these different things, then we will find meaning and wholeness and happiness and be complete. And it really pushes us into this myth of independence. And this is something I've thought about a lot, that the idea that we teach our kids independence, we're raising them and they're going to school, and our hope, right, parents, that they leave our house at 18. They go out into the world in college and they're getting jobs and they're doing the same thing. And so we push and we teach independence, be responsible, independence. And yet, independence is not possible. How many people did it take to pave the road that you drove on to get here? How many people designed the clothes that you put on this morning? How many people put them together, shipped them to the store, stocked the shelves, sold them to you? How many people designed your coffee maker? How many people picked your coffee beans? How many people designed the grinder? How many people made your car? I mean, you can just keep going with this. Every single thing that we do in our lives is marked by the fact that we are dependent fully on hundreds and hundreds of people every single day just to have the myth of independence. And yet we buy into it, so we consume, we go, whatever I want, whatever I need. In a lot of ways, this image of life, this view of life, is best illustrated with the idea of looking in a mirror. The only reflection that we get, the only thing that we see is what we choose to put into the mirror. We look into that mirror, we look back at ourselves, and we begin to make distinctions on the way we think and what we need and what we want and how we look and who we are. And so it becomes limited, it's self-focused. And yet, unfortunately, it doesn't work. One scholar, in an article at a Baylor Center for Ethics, he said this: consumerism as a character-cultivating way of life encourages the least attractive human traits: avarice, aggression, and self-centeredness. As consumerism becomes an increasingly individualistic and private affair, we risk losing the key virtues that stabilize and promote social life. Things like caring for others, compromise, friendship, responsibility to the past, and felt obligation for the future. And so it's not just that we're consuming, but it's also our consuming is becoming privatized. Every time you pick up your phone, the information you consume on that, your news feed, your social media feed, the advertisements on your Gmail for what you want to go buy on Amazon, it's all curated by algorithms that are trying to figure out who you are, and so let's just push all the things that you want. And so then you can just click. You don't even have to interact with people. And now more and more, the Walmart in Norwalk by my house is now fully self-checkouts. Fully. And so we can even go to stores and not interact with people or not need things from other people, so we think, because we just go through the self-checkout lines. And so we buy into this myth of independence, and all it does is leads to conflict, tension. Because when I want something goes against what you want, it's going down, right? That's what we do. And that's exactly what we see here in the disciples. Jesus says to John and to James, do you guys really want to drink the drink I'm going to drink? Do you really think you can experience the baptism that I will? And they say yes. And so Jesus says, yeah, you're actually going to get both, which is ironic in our hindsight because Jesus was talking about sacrifice and death. They took it as power and opportunity. And so what do the other 10 do? They get indignant. No, we deserve those seats. Why do they get the good stuff? We want to drink it too. We, I want this. And it just leads to this fighting. James and John's request for closeness to Christ excludes the other disciples from the same sense of closeness. And so they have this consumer mindset, driving after status and power, and it's all about me. And again, if we're really honest, that mindset doesn't just impact our social lives or our work lives or the way that we operate and buy things that we want, but it also impacts our faith. This phenomenon of church shopping thanks to the internet, that we can go on and we can compare reviews, and we're going to go to this church and that church and this church and that church. And when I find the right one that has everything that I want, where people think like me, that the children's ministry is just so, that the preaching is just this, that they believe this exact thing, well, then I'll land there. And it's been shared with us at our Heart and Soul Sunday, the idea if you ever find a perfect church, don't go, because you'll ruin it. Right? But that's this mindset that we tend to have. We leave a gathering like this on a Sunday morning, and we're talking about, did I like the sermon or not? Was the music very good? Did my kids like it or not? And those questions are not bad in and of themselves, but yet at their heartbeat, it's this consumer mentality, do whatever I want for me. And that's a big marker of our season of discernment right now. We cannot, as a community, give in to this consumer mentality of this is the right way for things to happen. This is exactly what we need as a church, and my opinion is right and everybody else is wrong. But we need to collectively lean in together and have a different mindset. And this is what Jesus encourages. As the disciples are fighting, as they're built in this tension and me, and I want that position and you don't deserve it, Jesus calls them together and he says, you know that those who are considered rulers of the Gentiles lord it over them, and their great ones exercise authority over them. The world and culture have this view of life, but it shall not be so among you. Jesus invites us through this symbol of the basin into a different perspective and a different way of life. And I want to just look at that text, and I'd invite you to you can just close your eyes for a moment. I want to read John 13, which describes this foot washing moment. Before the feast of the Passover, when Jesus knew that his hour had come to depart out of this world to the Father, having loved his own who were in the world, he loved them to the end. During supper, when the devil had already put it into the heart of Judas Iscariot, Simon's son, to betray him, Jesus, knowing that the Father had given all things into his hands, and that he had come from God and was going back to God, rose from supper. He laid aside his outer garments, and taking a towel, tied it around his waist. Then he poured water into a basin and began to wash the disciples' feet and to wipe them with the towel that was wrapped around him. He came to Simon Peter, who said to him, Lord, do you wash my feet? Jesus answered him, what I am doing you do not understand now, but afterward you will understand. Peter said to him, you shall never wash my feet. Jesus answered him, if I do not wash you, you have no share with me. Simon Peter said to him, Lord, not my feet only, but also my hands and my head. Jesus said to him, the one who is bathed does not need to wash except for his feet, but it is completely clean. You are clean, but not every one of you. For he knew who was to betray him. That was why he said, not all of you are clean. When he had washed their feet and put on his outer garments and resumed his place, he said to them, do you understand what I have done to you? You call me teacher and Lord, and you are right, for so am I. But if I then, your Lord and teacher, have washed your feet, you also ought to wash one another's feet. For I have given you an example that you also should do just as I have done to you. And so there's this powerful display of a very different way of living. This mindset of the culture that Jesus says, so it shall not be with you, shifts away from being a consumer. I want me, get, more, and instead shifts to that as a contributor. Recognizing that we are part of a whole, that there's more than one perspective, that we have something to contribute, something to give, that we would be generous, that we would be serving. This contributor heartbeat is marked by this servant attitude of one of humility, not jumping to the front saying, do whatever I want, but instead marked by stepping back and saying, God, what do you want? And then the next question is, well, what do they want? Then that last question, well, what do I need? What do I want? It's broadening this circle from just about me to just about you and to be about many. There's a lot within this exchange that happens between Jesus and the disciples as he's washing their feet. Jesus disrobes. He takes off his outer garments. Nudity in skin was a very taboo thing. And so for Jesus, the master, the rabbi, to do this, and then to pick up the basin, which was a job for slaves and for servants to do. It was a disgusting job, walking around in sandals in the sand and the dust. And so Jesus to get down and do that, and this is why Peter is so thrown off. Jesus, are you going to wash my feet? Like, that's not your job. That's not the way the world works. Power, status, authority, me, do what you want. That's what you should be doing, Jesus. You're the Messiah. And Jesus pushes back. Peter, you don't understand. Peter then challenges again. No, you're not going to wash my feet. This is the way the world works. And Jesus says, well, if I don't wash you, you will have no part in me. And all of a sudden, that pushes Peter to realize there's another perspective, another way of seeing the world. And so Peter goes to the opposite extreme and says, okay, Jesus, well, then don't just wash my feet, but wash my hands and wash my head as well. Look at how different of a question that is. Lord, do whatever we want. Okay, Lord, if you say so, why don't you wash my hands and my head as well? And so Jesus models this humility and servitude. Jesus was the Messiah. It was God in flesh. He could have marched into Jerusalem. He could have overthrown Rome. He could have set up a throne. He could have done it all that way, but he didn't. He modeled a life of sacrifice and giving and generosity and putting the other before himself. And one of the other details in this account that I've always been drawn to is the fact that we have two references right at the beginning. Satan had already provoked Judas to betray Jesus. And it says that Jesus knew that. And so to a certain degree, as he sat with these 12 disciples, one of them he knew was his enemy. So Jesus could have put his foot down. He could have threw Judas out. He could have said, man, like, you're a jerk. I know what you're going to do to me. You've got things so wrong. Does Jesus do any of that? No. Jesus chooses to serve and to be generous and to be humble to even his enemy and the one who would betray him. And so it's not this narrow focus of me. It's not this narrow focus of just my group of people who think and act and feel just like I do. But Jesus is purposely serving the people who think completely different than he did. We're going to cause him pain and harm. In a lot of ways, this shift compared to the mirror, it's a lot like looking at life through a lens. It's not refined to just whatever you're putting in front of it, but instead it's this wide perspective. Think of this panoramic lens that's getting this wide view that you're taking in the world and the things around you, that you're participating in, you're contributing to, and you have a role to give to. And this is what Jesus invites us into. If I, then your Lord and teacher, have washed your feet, you also ought to wash one another's feet. For I have given you an example that you also should do just as I have done to you. And so what would it look like to be a community as Trinity Church that is not marked by all of us asking, do what I want? But instead, what would it look like to have a community that is marked by turning to your neighbor and washing their feet? And don't worry, we're not going to do that literally, okay? But what would that attitude shift look like? How would our lives look differently if instead of looking at our finances and our budgets, and we are crying out to God, God, do what we want, but instead we're looking at our budgets and our finances and we're holding them before God and we're asking God, okay, God, what do you want me to do with my finances? I've often thought I wish Jesus had put finances into the Sermon on the Mount, because I think it fits in really well. And kind of this idea of, you've heard it said to give 10%, but I say to you, give 100%. Tithing and 10% is a really great starting point. It's a great challenge to think about. But in reality, God doesn't want 10% of your finances. He wants 100%. And so what would it look like to have a mindset, not what I want, but instead, Jesus, hey, what do you want? What would it look like to say, with our material possessions, with our homes, with our gifts, with our talents, not, God, what I want, but instead, God, what do you want? What does the person next to me need? What does the 8-year-old in TK need from somebody in this room? What does that high schooler struggling with life need from you as an adult in your life experience? What does the newcomer walking through our doors for the first time need from one of your smiling faces at the door saying good morning? What does the homeless person at New Covenant Center need from you coming to provide a meal? Because Jesus invites us through this symbol of the basin to be contributors in the work that is going on in the world, that we would be servants and that we would be humble and that we would be asking the question, God, what do you want from me? And as we close, I'd invite you all to stand. I want to just take a moment of reflection. And what I'd like you to do, I'd like you to put your hands out in front of you, but then I'd like you to make a fist and clasp it as tight as you can. And just hold them in that position here for a moment as we pray, and then I'll give another instruction. Jesus, we just acknowledge that it is way too easy to fall into just that consumer mindset, God, that we have things in our lives that we hold on tight to. Jesus, we have asked that same question that James and John have asked. God, we want you to do whatever we want. And so, God, we acknowledge that in our hands we hold on to our finances, we hold on to our calendars, we hold on to our gifts and our talents, our homes, our stuff, our attitudes, our grudges, our anger. And God, we hold those tight. We keep them to ourselves. And then we ask for more. And so, God, we just come before you with all of that mindset. We thank you for your grace and your forgiveness and this invitation into a better way to live. And with that, I'd invite you to just open your hands. Do you feel that difference? The blood flowing through your fingers and that the life that flows through your hands, the tingling a little bit in your hands. That's the freedom that Jesus invites us into, that we would have a life that's life to the overflowing, that's not just good, that's not just filling our needs, but is actually bubbling out into others. And so, Jesus, we hold our hands open-handed right now before you, asking us to make us contributors. Reframe our hearts, reframe our minds, that we would be looking, God, of how we can give and how we can participate. We thank you for the life that you modeled for us. And God, just as you, our Lord and our Master, washed the feet of your disciples, we ask that you would make us a people who are willing to wash the feet of our friends, of the people around us, and even our enemies. And so, God, may we hold our lives open-handed before you. Speak to us to this question, God. What do you want us to do? What do you want us to contribute? How are you leading us to give and to participate in your work in the world? And let's just sit with that question for 1 minute.